Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. It is the Ides of March, so it's appropriately time for some funny business. We'll meet a murdering veterinarian, a nerd who embezzles, a Secret Service officer who counterfeits, brutes in Baltimore and Texas, and our first heist by a member of the supernatural. Spoiler alert, it is a mummy. Now it's time to explore these stories in quick hitter style. We'll head back down to Dixie, courtesy of the Cordell Dispatch and its March 12, 1927 edition. The story was titled Elliot on Way Back to Gang, and it was subtitled Escaped Life Convict Was Caught in Florida. But not just any convict. Dr. J. M. Elliot, a veterinary surgeon, had escaped from the Georgia penitentiary way back in 1920. However, on March 11, 1927, he was on his way back to Bainbridge, Georgia, in the company of officers. He was returning to complete his life sentence. Why life sentence? Elliot was returning to the Decatur County chain gang, having been sentenced to it for the 1908 murder of one George Rivers, a hotel keeper in LaGrange, Georgia. Well, it turns out that Elliot had been living in the Tampa area for at least 1 year. He worked at a veterinary hospital on a part-time basis, but was arrested for writing worthless checks. Now, he'd been held in county jail for about a month. About 20 days into his latest jailing, he was taken for fingerprints, at which point, when he'd been captured and his fingerprints had been taken, he confessed to being Dr. Elliot, and he confessed to the crimes for which he was wanted. Aside from the murder of Rivers, he was sought for violating parole at Dallas, Texas. There, he'd served 4 years out of a 10-year sentence for bank robbery in that area. Feds even wanted him for removing stolen automobiles across state lines. And it was, in fact, the warden of the Decatur County convict camps, H.R. Duval, and an assistant warden who personally escorted Elliot back by car to Georgia. From the deep south to the Midwest we go, where the Arizona Miners March 12, 1927 edition brings us a story titled Vigilantes Halt Bank Robberies. It was subtitled Make Iowa Very Unpopular Place for Hold-Up Men to Operate. So who are we talking about? Dave Harding, 44, and a fisherman on the Missouri River. Broy Harding, that's B-R-O-Y, 23, and a blacksmith. What did they do? Well, they robbed the bank at Modale, Iowa. That's M-O-D-A-L-E. When? The report noted 10 a.m. on one morning. We'll look for specifics on that. How did they do it? Well, unfortunately, violently. They shot the cashier, grabbed $4,500, and ran out the door where they were met by a hail of bullets. They escaped and got to their getaway car, but not until they'd shot yet another man. They raced their way towards the Missouri River, apparently abandoned the car, crossed over the ice flows of the icy river, and hitched a ride from a passerby. And they successfully made it out of Iowa and got to Omaha, Nebraska. Easy, right? Well, not when Iowa is involved, as their motto was, if you rob a bank in Iowa, you get caught. The Hardings went to check into a boarding house that it appears that they lined up in advance and were met by 4 Omaha detectives, each aiming a riot gun or other weapon at the Harding brothers. It was between 2 and 3 p.m., and the robbery had already been solved. Well, Iowa gives us another example of the success of the vigilante committees. It seems that Iowa vigilantes existed in almost every county, and they were actually organized by the Iowa Bankers Association. Their phone numbers were held by most of the small-town telephone operators, and in fact, the operator who gave the first notice of a bank robbery was rewarded with a payment of $25. So the operators called out members and committee heads in the different counties and provided as good a description as they could of the robbers and the getaway vehicle. They called sheriffs and marshals around the state as well, and even called farmers to have them keep an eye out while they were out working in the fields. Oh, and it was well known that there was a $1,000 reward that was enacted automatically upon notice of a robbery, and the robbers were wanted dead or alive. Each member, by the way, was sworn in, but only acted in the case of active bank robberies, and they were not compensated other than the possibility of receiving the reward. And life imprisonment was the penalty for any daytime robberies in Iowa. Well, the Indianapolis Times brought us a story titled, "Admits $19,000 Theft, Sorry for His Family." It's subtitled, "Banker, 50, receives 2-year term in U.S. court. Son returns from college to care for mother." It turns out that a George H. Coleman, age 50, had embezzled approximately $19,000 from the First National Bank at Jeffersonville, Indiana. Coleman stood before Judge Robert C. Baltzell, that's Baltzell, and pled guilty, explaining that he'd taken the money, quote, just a little at a time, end quote, over a 19-year period. He stated, quote, "I started in thinking I would replace my first theft, but I never have," end quote. The judge countered, quote, "How could you sleep at night through all those years," end quote. Coleman replied, quote, "I don't know myself," end quote. Well, the guilt ate at him until his son came home from Purdue University for the Christmas break. It was at that point that he decided that he could confess, which meant the son was leaving college to take care of his mother. People clearly were surprised, including his friends, that this nerdish accountant had embezzled all this money. Well, Coleman teared up at sentencing when the judge said, quote, "If I were to release him now, the chances are he would go straight for the rest of his life," end quote. But Judge Baltzell added that the nation's youths were watching. That part was not a direct quote. The maximum sentence was 5 years, a $5,000 fine, or both. Coleman was heading to Leavenworth. Well, we head east, leaving behind the nerdy, gentle accountant type for a violent gunman. The Evening Star's March 20, 1927 edition ran a story, "Two Shot in Bank Robbery Attempt." It was subtitled, "Employees of Baltimore Institution Wounded, Drive Off Gunman." Here's how it happened. 3 robbers attempted to hold up the Provident Savings Bank's Monument Street branch, with 2 robbers remaining outside. Presumably, one was at the steering wheel with the engine running and the other was standing guard nearby. One of the robbers entered the bank and went up to the teller cage of 20-year-old Robert J. McNally. He instantly fired through the glass, the bullet tearing through McNally's throat and another smashing into his jaw. McNally, naturally, crumpled to the floor. Bank manager Damon L. Gaskin, spelled D-E-M-O-N. I'm assuming he pronounced it Damon. Maybe Demon, but I'm going with Damon. He was clipped by one of the shots. He grabbed a revolver from under the counter. Gaskin fired at the bandit, who then backtracked. As the bandit got to the door, he turned around and fired again, striking Gaskin in the side. Gaskin was now nicked and hit, but he kept firing, most likely striking the robber as blood splattered on a divan or couch that was near the doorway. Witnesses outside said the robber emerged and he covered his face up with a coat lapel. He leaped into the car and the car sped away. Incidentally, that automobile was later found in an alley and was identified as, shocker, having been stolen. Happily, doctors said that neither McNally nor Gaskin was likely to die, and no money was stolen. McNally and Gaskin will be added to the Memorial Honor Roll for those killed or injured by bank robbers during an attempt. The Brownsville Herald brought us "Hold Former U.S. Officer," subtitled "Faces Charges Counterfeiting and embezzlement. We are talking about William J. Eddick. Eddick had been wounded several times during World War I and was even cited for gallantry. He was the former head of the Secret Service in El Paso, Texas, and, at least according to Eddick, he'd been assigned to be part of the guard of the late President Harding on Harding's trip to Alaska. Eddick was also an operative in New Orleans, where he was known around town and attended parties and frequented clubs, and so he was maybe a bit of a dandy. He also employed the alias J.W. Benson. So what happened? Well, government agents in El Paso, Texas, were investigating an expert ring of counterfeiters based on an arraignment of Eddick. He'd been brought in for passing two $50 gold certificates at the Security Bank and Trust Company in Amity, Louisiana, back in July of 1926. Amity, A-M-I-T-E. Maybe it's pronounced Amite, but surely it's Amity, which means surely it's Amite. He'd also been charged with embezzling a government pistol very recently for our study in February of 1927. Of course, Eddick pleaded not guilty to both charges. His bail was set at $750 for the pistol, which is not a big deal, but $10,000 for the counterfeiting charge. While not able to make bail, the hearing was set for March 25, 1927, although Eddick stated that he would contact friends in New Orleans and he would be able to raise bail money. Well, we'll stay with the Brownsville Herald and check out its 100 font headline titled Unmasked Bandits Loot Small Bank at Ovalo. And its slightly reduced font for the subtitle, Secure $4,000, Miss $12,000 in U.S. Securities. It's subtitled, Cashier Gives Immediate Alarm, Robbers Make Escape in Fast Automobile. So who are we talking about? At this point, two unknown unmasked bandits, where the First State Bank of Ovalo, O-V-A-L-L-O. It's spelled Ovalo, O-V-A-L-O, and Ovayo or Ovayo, O-V-A-L-L-O, with the Spanish influence. When did it occur? Very specifically, Saturday, March 26th, 1927 at 11:20 a.m. So $4,000 was stolen, minus around $40 or so in small change that the robbers dropped between exiting the bank and getting into their car. The duo grabbed and ordered bookkeeper Joe Harrison to go into the vault and grab up all the loot, while Harrison left the bonds behind. And the only other person present was I.N. Wilkinson, a cashier. Once they had the loot in hand, they ran for the sidewalk, jumped into a large sedan that was left with the engine running, and then jetted eastward towards Cross Plains, Texas, at an estimated speed of 60 or 70 miles per hour. Finally, the Douglas Daily Dispatch brings us an odd robbery from California, titled Los Angeles Bank Robbery Puzzles Police. It could have been perhaps better titled Heist of the Mummy, where the Merchants National Trust and Savings Bank's Hoover Street branch in Los Angeles, a holdup man replete with a pair of revolvers. However, his face was completely masked with bandages and strips of adhesive tapes. Detectives termed the robber a, quote, nut, end quote, after finding scraps of lunch, orange peels, peepholes drilled through the floor, and a cut and rewired burglar alarm in the loft. It seems that the mummy had been hiding in that loft space for 3 days and 3 nights. Then suddenly, he dropped down from the loft and surprised the 6 employees. The mummy then herded the 6 employees into a rear room where they were locked in. Then he seemed to take a leisurely approach to scooping up approximately $8,000 in cash, and then he left in a car that he had parked behind the bank. Philip Simon, the bank manager, said, quote, his appearance struck terror into them all, end quote, and that he, quote, appeared exactly like a mummy, end quote. So that was crazy. Murdering veterinarian, a relatively victimless embezzlement by a nerd, as well as a Secret Service officer. Then we have the brutality in Baltimore, the swiftness in Texas, and of course our first heist by a member of the supernatural. Next up, we'll head south to North Florida and rejuvenate. We'll see a cashier killed in North Dakota. We'll observe a young, selfless robber in Oklahoma. And we'll even hear the National Guard called out in Arkansas. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.